While we were not meeting in the building, we received a mailing of the spiritual sword. I got mine rather early. I think the rest of them came kind of late. And when these come in, I try to review kind of what's going on with the spiritual sword as one of my sermons, to encourage you to get one of these and to take it home and read it and be familiar with it and know where to have that as you need it, and when time comes that you need these things. And what a good issue for troubled times is this issue of the spiritual sword. Let me just show you some of the lessons. If you'll read the spiritual, these are the titles of the articles that are in the spiritual sword concerning the book of Job. Dealing with temptation. What kind of man was Job? Is Satan real? The patience of Job. How to deal with adversity. Coping with the loss of health. Coping with the loss of a loved one. Lessons from Job's friends. There is reassurance from God. Things man does not know. God blesses the faithful. The book of Job for us today. Lessons to remember. And then a passage from the prophets about Noah, Daniel, and Job. Now doesn't that just look like rich material? And as you look at that, you might be thinking, why don't we spend more time studying Job if it's got so many good lessons? And let me tell you, that's just a taste of what we can draw and learn from this book. This is just a little bit of the things we can learn from there. So why don't we spend more time studying Job? Well, I'll tell you why. That's because Job is a hard book to study. The story's not too hard. You have a good man that had just about everything, and he lost almost everything, and he was tempted. Now you just curse God and die. And people saying, Job, it's your fault. But Job said, no, that's not it, and I don't understand this. And he held fast to his integrity, and in the end, he was blessed again. Well, that's just a very simplistic look at that story. It goes in much more depth than that. And the story can be told pretty much with just the first and second chapter and the last chapter. 3 chapters pretty well give you the story. What's in between on those 42 chapters is a discussion between Job and his friends. And what makes this difficult is trying to follow their thinking in this discussion back and forth. They're discussing deep things. And you find out when you get to the end of the book that none of them knew what they were talking about. And so you have, and then not only that, it's written in poetry. And let me tell you something about Bible poetry that really challenges a translator when you're translating ancient Hebrew poetry into English. And that is, the more literal that you translate that poetry, the more obscure it becomes. And so this idea of, well, let's make it easy, and we'll use a dynamic equivalent and kind of explain it in our translation so it's easy. But when you do that, you lose the depth and the breadth and the beauty of that poetry. So if you really want to get the best out of the book of Job, you'll get a good translation and then really study it and think about it and see what others have said and start pulling together what is being taught. And if you will put the work into it, the beauty and the depth and the genius of it is something you will love and appreciate. But if you're looking for something to just kind of zip through and read pretty easy, you don't want to read Job. You'll just be reading words without understanding. And so that's why we don't study it more. It's got all of these good lessons in it. But you got to keep thinking when you study the book of Job. Let me give you a little more in depth on that storyline and give you a few keys to where if you want to read Job and get into Job and understand it, it'll be worth your while. But if you want to do it, here's a few things you ought to know. Let's see how it begins. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. You know, when I think of the land of Uz, I know what comes to my mind. I was a little boy running home after church to watch the Wizard of Oz. You know, the land of Oz is what I think of. And that's not too far off. What is the land of Uz? Where was that? Something far away in the distant past that's somewhat obscure to us. And I think you could dig down and maybe figure out maybe it's over near Edom somewhere or something, but you don't have to know that. It's an ancient land far in the past. And there was a patriarch there by the name of Job. That man was perfect and upright, one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men in the East. Quite an impressive individual. But now the scene changes. Well, no, talking about Job. Just show you how good he was. Look what a good father he was. His sons went and feasted in their houses, every one in his day, and sent and called for their sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, and the days of their feasting were gone about. Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. See, he's a patriarch. He's a father to his children. And he's concerned about their spiritual welfare. What a fine man. Well, now the scene changes. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And you can almost hear God's pride in Job as we read this. The Lord said unto Satan, "Whence comest thou?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth and walking it up and down." And the Lord said unto Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there's none like him in all the earth, perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil?" God was proud of Job. And then here's the key. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Doth Job fear God for naught?" You look at Job and you know the book of Job is about suffering. But that's not really the main purpose of Job, to explain suffering. Because there's a lot of questions we still have about suffering at the end of the book that Job does not address. This is what Job is about. Doth Job fear God for naught? You think he's doing this for nothing? Why, you hedged him in. Look how good you've been to him. I tell you why Job served God. He knows what he's getting out of it. And Job, see, is the Satan here is the accuser. And that's what the word means. He's accusing Job before God. He's going to turn around and accuse God before Job. Satan's always accusing. He said, yeah, he serves you because he's getting blessed by you. That's what this is about. He's really just self-centered. He's for himself. And so the question is, does anyone do good for goodness sake? And so Job is a book about skepticism. Well, Let's see what happens. Is Job a good man just because he's blessed? Or is he serving God because God is God and he knows that's right and that's good? And so the Lord told him, says, you take it. Take what he's got away from him. See what happens. And so in one day, Satan lost everything. Job lost everything he had, either by theft, from raiding bands, or natural calamities, and he even lost all of his children. At the end of that day, Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Well, Satan says, yeah, that's because you didn't let me touch him. Yeah, he lost all these things, but he's still in good shape. You let me lay my hands on him. You'll see what he'll do. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down in the ashes. And then his wife did this. You talk about a lonely, lost man. When your own wife comes up against you, and she's had all she can take. She said, dost thou still retain thy integrity? Curse God and die. What does it mean, retain thy integrity? Job said, this isn't because of me. It's not something I've done wrong that this has happened to me. Job's wife said, you still saying that? Just curse God and die. You need to give this up. But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not Job sin with his lips. The patience of Job. That means he endured. He suffered under this. Satan couldn't crack him. Well, the friends show up. And to start with, I'm very proud of these friends. They're to be commended. What do you do when someone has suffered such things in their life? What do you do? We can learn some good things from these friends. They heard of this evil that was come upon him. They came every one from his own place. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. So they came to mourn with him and to comfort him. And you know, the New Testament teaches us to weep with those that weep. And that's what they came to do. And it was worse than they thought. They lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not. This didn't even look like Job. And they lifted up their voice and wept, and rent everyone his mantle, and sprinkled dust on their own head, and sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. They stayed with him a week, and they wept with him. And what do you say? And there's many times that I've wondered, what do I say? And I hadn't known what to say. And oftentimes you don't really have to say something. Just tell them, I'm here for you. And let people grieve. They go through a grieving process. And people need to grieve. And these are good, patient, long-suffering friends to go with Job and then just to be there. But there's problems going to arise. Now, after 7 days, Job talks. And he opened his mouth. Now, he didn't curse God, but he cursed his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there's a man-child conceived. And all through the 3rd chapter of Job, Job is pouring out his heart of lament in what terrible situation he is, and just wish it'd been better if I'd never been born to have gone through this. And then we get into the discussion. Now here's what happens. Well, these men, I'm going to save that one until next. Let me go there. Here's what happens. Job speaks first. That's chapter 3. And then Eliphaz speaks. And then Job answers. And Bildad speaks. And Job answers. And Zophar speaks. And Job answers. That's round 1. Now round 2. Eliphaz speaks again, and Job answers, and Bildad speaks, and Job answers, and Zophar speaks, and Job answers, round 2. All right, round 3. Eliphaz speaks again, and Job answers, and Bildad speaks, and Job answers. And you're going after chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter, and here's what they're talking about. Here's what they're saying. The friends of Job are convinced, Job, you messed up. Job, you've done something wrong. There's some evil. Either it's down in your heart or some action that you've hidden or something. This is your fault. This has happened to you some way. And Job maintains his integrity. No, that's not the reason. It's not because of me. And he questions our concept of justice when it comes to God. And Job is saying, God ought to explain this to me. I don't understand it. And he offers several ideas, but why doesn't God just show up and tell me? And they go on and on and on and on like this, for chapter after chapter after chapter of this, and they're speaking in this difficult poetry. Now that's why Job is difficult. And not only that, you're going through all this, and they're not getting anywhere. The friends hadn't changed their minds about Job. And Job hadn't changed his response to them. And so unless you really love poetry, this can get kind of tedious to keep going after chapter on this. Now if you learn to love the poetry, you'll be fascinated with every line of it. But it's not the way we usually read. You see what a mental challenge it's going to be to absorb all this? But then, after Job speaks that last time, Zophar doesn't say anything, but another fellow shows up by the name of Elihu. And Elihu is younger than these other men that had been talking, and he's a wise young man because he let them speak first. And then when they said all they could say, Elihu says, I think you all got it wrong. And he chastises those 3 friends for accusing Job without knowing of anything that Job has done wrong. He says you shouldn't accuse him that way. But he also chastises Job for thinking that God would have to answer him and the questioning the justice of God in that. He chastises Job. He chastises every one of them. Now, as Elihu speaks, if you'll begin to look in the things he says, a storm's coming up. First it's far off, and he'll make reference to it, and then it's coming closer. And by the time Elihu is ended what he has to say, the storm breaks upon them in all its fury. And in Job 38, God speaks to Job himself out of that storm. And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and says, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? See, you folks, you say, you don't know what you're talking about. Gird up now thy loins like a man. I will demand of thee, and thou answer me. Job has been saying, God needs to answer me and tell me. And God said, Job, you tell me. And then he begins to ask question after question after question that Job cannot answer. There's so much Job does not understand. God's thoughts are higher than man's thoughts. And the Lord answered, and Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. That's what you do. You don't have anything to say. But God's not through. And God tells him about the behemoth and the Leviathan. And after that, Job answered the Lord and said, I know Thou canst do everything, and that no fault can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. Here I beseech thee, and I will speak. I got some verses confused here, I think. But it says, I've heard thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye seeth thee, wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. That's what Job is saying here. So he just gives up. He recognizes, I'm not going to understand it, and I don't have to, because this is God. And he humbles himself to that. Now, reminds me of Romans 9:20, which we were studying on Wednesday night not long ago. Remember when the children were up here playing with the clay? Who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say unto him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? And one thing we learn from Job, is we may not have all the answers. It doesn't mean they're not answers, but we may not have all the answers. Job never did get all his questions answered. Not in Job. Well, the Lord blessed him. It was so after the Lord spoke these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temite, my wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends. For you've not spoken to me the thing that is right, as my servant Job had. Boy, those friends ought to join in with Job and says, yeah, we didn't know what we was talking about, but they just sitting there. God says, I'm angry at you. Therefore take to you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept, unless I deal with you after your folly. And that ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. So Eliphaz the Temite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did according as the Lord commanded them. The Lord also accepted Job, and the Lord turned the captivity from Job when he prayed for his friends. And the Lord also gave Job twice as much as he had before. And then came unto him all his brethren and his sisters, and all they had been of his acquaintance before, and did eat bread with him in his house. And they bemoaned him, and comforted him over the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Every man according to a piece of money, and every one an earring of gold. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than the beginning. I've got another book at home, written by G. Campbell Morgan. Now, it's just a little bitty thin paperback. If you want to look it up on Amazon.com, I tell you, you're going to pay big money for this little book because it's rare. And I got it before it went rare, evidently. I got it many years ago. It's one of the best studies of Job that I've ever had. It's called The Answers of Jesus to Job. See, Job asked questions. How should man be just with God? Well, Job didn't know. Job didn't know. Job asked, if a man dies, shall he live again? He didn't know. And many other things like this that come up in the book of Job, to which Job and his 3 friends, they just don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. But when we learn about Jesus, Jesus answers these questions. We learn how to be just with God. We learn that man will live again. And think about Job now. He didn't know about Jesus. We know so much more than Job and his 3 friends. Why, Job didn't even have the book of Job to help him. And we've got so much more knowledge we have to help us deal. And if we will learn these things and study, we'll understand and we'll know. We'll appreciate what's happening to us in life. And we'll approach it with a manner, and I said, we won't feel guilty every time something bad happens to us. Things happen to us, but, well, I must be being punished for my sins. Well, sometimes Sometimes sin brings hard consequences on people, but that's not always the reason bad things happen to people. And we'll learn from Job and the rest of the Bible and Jesus how to cope with all these things that occur in our lives. And we'll accept it, even the part we don't fully understand. The book of Job ends like this. This is the last verse and the last words. So Job died, being old and full of days. What an amazing life that man led. And yet he died. And that last verse then leaves us where? It leaves us looking at eternity. All things don't always come out good in this life. Every story is not going to be like Job, where the end comes out better than the beginning. Every story won't end that way. Not on this earth, not under the sun. But there's an eternity. And then we'll understand. And then things will be made right. Now, Job didn't know this, but we know that. And we can look at life beyond life to help us know how to cope with this life. There's a study of Job and Solomon. You got the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes. And I like to kind of look at those two books together. Because with Job, you had a man that had everything. And he lost it all. And with Solomon in Ecclesiastes, you had a man that had everything. And he kept it all. And when you get to the end of those books, they come to the same conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Well, you learn otherwise what Jesus said. A man's life consisteth not in the abundance of things which he possesseth. And so I think it's interesting how these two books just come back to the same point there, don't they? And it tells us what we need to do. We need to fear God and keep His commandments. I don't understand this pandemic we're facing. And the more I have studied and learned about it, the more I'm convinced the experts don't understand it either. I don't really understand all of the riots going on and the lawlessness that is. I can't relate to that. I don't have to have answers for all of that. I do understand what my duty before God is. And I can walk in His ways and do His will. And I can leave the things I don't understand in His hands. And knowing that someday they'll say, Bill has died. Maybe they'll say an old man and full of days. I don't know. But I'll go into eternity. And if I've left things in God's hands, I'll go into His hands. And I have that confidence as I face the turmoils of life. Now, you need to have that confidence. Like we studied in this morning, those who are the family of God, those that obey Him. So you need to be baptized into Christ and live a keeping with this book. And then there's nothing the devil can throw at you that you and God together won't be able to handle. If you need to respond to this invitation, then do it as we stand and sing.